The desert air held the sharp scent of creosote after a brief winter rain, and a thin crust of frost silvered the scrub. 23rd December 1944, Papago Park POW Camp, Arizona. A cold moon lit the Salt River's dry bed until it shimmered like water, a deception that pleased Capitan Zur See Jürgen Wattenberg. He eased himself into the tunnel mouth his men had dug for 3 long months, 178 feet of scraped sand and gravel carved with mess spoons and stolen shovels. The passage sloped away like a miner's vein, its walls braced by scavenged boards from the camp's own supply shed. He had commanded U-boats in the Atlantic, a veteran of the Battle of the Caribbean, and he carried into the desert the expectation of an enemy as merciless as his own navy. Nazi broadcasts warned that capture by Americans meant humiliation, perhaps worse. Tonight's escape, he told his men, would reclaim a fragment of dignity before Germany's final collapse. They would raft the Gila, reach the Colorado, and cross into Mexico. Above-ground Captain James Whitaker, a 26-year-old Iowa farm boy turned provost marshal officer, made his midnight rounds. The guard towers spaced at 100-yard intervals loomed like sentinels of steel and pine. Double barbed wire gleamed faintly, each strand beaded with frost. Whitaker paused to listen, only the hiss of the desert wind and the far-off yip of a coyote. His war was one of vigilance, not glory, but he knew the stakes. The Geneva Convention of 1929 demanded that America hold even its enemies with discipline and humanity, and any lapse would be exploited by German propaganda and might endanger American prisoners of war in Europe. Beneath his boots, Wattenberg's party inched forward. They had measured every foot with naval precision, aligning their tunnel to emerge beyond the outer fence. At the surface they would find, or so they believed, a river deep enough to float their crude canvas rafts. But when they broke into the moonlight hours later, they met only the wide, dry riverbed, sand rippling like a frozen sea. The Salt River in winter is often no river at all, its flow dammed upstream for irrigation. They would have to march miles before they could even glimpse the Gila. Wattenberg did not yet know that every mile of that march would bring an unexpected lesson. He would meet American patrols who carried jeeps with new M38 field radios, men who could summon a search without firing a shot. He would be recaptured without a single blow struck, offered coffee before questioning, and returned to camp without reprisal. The real freedom lay not beyond the wire, but in the restraint of those who guarded it. The desert sky paled toward dawn as the fugitives disappeared into the wash. Above, Whitaker checked his wristwatch, 0200 hours, and turned toward the command hut, unaware that the night's quiet drama was already reshaping a prisoner's idea of liberty. 1,000 miles away and 11 months earlier, January 1944 brought a different kind of cold. At Camp Algona in north-central Iowa, the wind cut across the prairie with a knife's edge, plunging temperatures to 15 degrees below zero. Inside a drafty workshop, 6 German craftsmen, former carpenters and stonemasons from the Ruhr, leaned over blocks of Iowa pine. Their breath hung in pale clouds as chisels bit into wood, the sound a dry rhythmic rasp. They were carving a nativity scene, figures half life-size, Mary, Joseph, shepherds, and kings. Anna Mae Kruger, the town's young librarian, pushed open the door carrying an armful of books, Goethe and Schiller, in their native tongue. She had volunteered to bring literature to the prisoners, believing that words could thaw suspicion better than any stove. The men straightened and offered polite greetings. Their uniforms were worn but clean, marked with the black PW stenciled across the back. She noticed the tools laid out with the care of guild craftsmen, hand saws and augers provided by the camp itself, left each night unguarded. The Germans had expected a harsher captivity. Letters from home spoke of bread stretched with sawdust and cities turned to rubble by Allied bombs. Here, even prisoners received K rations heavy with sugar and a 4-pack of commercial cigarettes, a ration that delivered roughly 2,830 calories a day. The scent of chocolate and Lucky Strikes drifted through the barracks each evening, a perfume of abundance unimaginable in wartime Europe. Anna May watched as Private Fritz Weber, his fingers nicked and calloused, shaped the delicate folds of the Madonna's robe. He worked with the quiet concentration of a man remembering a childhood Christmas before the smoke of war. When he paused to warm his hands over the iron stove, he told her in careful English that such generosity, wood, tools, and trust would have been impossible in the Reich. He and his comrades understood that the Americans could have locked every saw behind bars, yet they did not. Outside the workshop, the snow squeaked underfoot like dry sand, and the wind rattled the wire fence that ringed the camp. But inside, cedar curls littered the floor like festive confetti. The figures, when finished, would stand more than 60 strong, each carved with the patience of men relearning hope. For years after the war, the Algona Nativity would be displayed every December, a silent testament to a freedom revealed not in speeches, but in the simple act of trust. As Anna May closed the door against the whistling night, she glanced once more at the Madonna's emerging face. The wood seemed to glow in the lamplight, as if the very grain carried the promise that generosity, even in wartime, could carve a new world. Autumn rain slicked the cobblestones of Narragansett Bay as a cold Atlantic wind rattled the windows of Fort Kearny, Rhode Island. Inside the converted barracks that now housed the Special Projects Division, the smell of ink and hot metal hung heavy. On the rotary press, fresh sheets of newsprint rattled and snapped like signal flags, each page carrying the black Gothic type of a new German-language newspaper, Der Ruf, the Call. It was the 1st of March, 1945, and the first issue was about to roll across 140 prisoner-of-war camps scattered through 46 states. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, a poet-turned-soldier, watched the pressmen feed the rollers. His mission went beyond mere compliance with the 1929 Geneva Convention. Washington had charged him with something audacious, to show captured German soldiers the strength of democracy not by preaching, but by letting them see it work. If free men could win their loyalty by example, then the collapse of Nazi ideology might begin even before the war ended. Among the first readers was Private Herbert Diedler, once a Bavarian infantryman, now held in a Pennsylvania branch camp. He turned the pages with cautious curiosity. The lead article called for a Germany beyond Hitler, a nation that could rejoin the civilized world. Diedler's brow furrowed. To his surprise, the paper also printed letters from prisoners, some praising, others ridiculing. He drafted his own, a sharp critique accusing Der Ruf of being little more than Allied propaganda. Weeks later, the next issue arrived, and there, beneath the masthead, his letter appeared in full, unchanged, uncut, unpunished. For a man raised under Goebbels' rigid press, it was a shock as powerful as any artillery barrage. In the Reich, dissent meant prison or worse. Here, even a prisoner's scorn was inked and shared. He would later tell fellow captives that this single act, printing a hostile letter, taught him more about freedom than any American speech. Davison understood the gamble. Hardline Nazis inside the camps tried to burn copies and threatened those who read them, yet the very controversy increased circulation. By April, print runs reached 30,000 and letters poured in by the thousands. The newspaper became a living argument, proving that democracy thrived on open disagreement. Outside, the Atlantic wind carried the briny smell of the sea and the distant clang of shipyard hammers. Those Liberty ships, 2,710 launched in the war years, some built in less than 5 days, were physical proof that industrial democracy could outproduce any tyranny. But for Diedler, The greater miracle was on the page before him, the quiet authority of words freely exchanged. As he folded the newspaper and slipped it into his tunic, the presses clattered on, sending freedom's cadence across the continent. Their metallic rhythm was more than noise. It was the heartbeat of an idea that would follow every prisoner home. Dawn broke pale and cold over a freight yard near Camp Aliceville, Alabama, early 1945. Mist curled from the black rails like breath from some great iron animal. POWs in gray uniforms. The letters PW stenciled across their backs hefted crates from flat cars into waiting trucks. The work was ordinary: flour, canned meat, drums of aviation fuel, but the scale defied imagination. Boxcar after boxcar stretched beyond sight, a seemingly endless river of American supply. Captain James Whitaker, temporarily attached to the camp from his Iowa post, paced the platform with a clipboard. He knew the numbers. The United States was moving 2.5 billion tons of freight a year by rail, feeding soldiers across 2 oceans while still stocking civilian shelves at home. A single Liberty ship leaving Mobile Bay tonight could carry 10,000 tons, more cargo than the entire Africa Corps had managed to land in North Africa during some months of the campaign. The German prisoners stole glances at the procession of goods. Letters from their families described nights without electricity, bread rationed to crusts, and children searching rubble for coal. Here, even prisoners' canteens sold chocolate bars and Lucky Strikes. They worked with the efficiency of trained soldiers but could not hide their astonishment at the abundance surrounding them. A sergeant handed Whitaker a tally sheet. He looked down the columns. Flour, 200 tons. Gasoline, 80,000 gallons. Machine parts by the thousands. He thought of the figures printed in Der Ruf: 96,270 aircraft built in 1944 alone. It was more than every Luftwaffe fighter and bomber ever fielded, and the numbers rolled through his mind like the clatter of coupling rods on steel. When the morning shift ended, the prisoners set down their gloves and stretched their backs. A young corporal named Karl Mueller nudged his companion, pointing at a distant train pulling in, 60 cars long, each loaded with grain. "All this," he said softly in German, "and they fight a war on 2 fronts." His friend only shook his head. The whistle of a departing locomotive shrieked through the mist, a sound both mournful and triumphant. Steam enveloped the prisoners in a brief, hot cloud, and when it cleared, the train was already gathering speed, vanishing into the southern pines. The yard fell quiet except for the ticking of cooling brakes, but the echo of iron on iron lingered like a drumbeat. Whitaker tucked the tally sheet under his arm and watched the last boxcar disappear. He knew that no single battle could match the significance of what these men had just witnessed. An industrial democracy whose abundance was itself a weapon, a force more relentless than any artillery barrage. The Kansas sun bore down like a brass plate in midsummer 1945, turning the wheat fields near Salina into a shimmering ocean of gold. German prisoners swung their scythes in rhythm with the wind, the PW stencils on their shirts already dusted the color of the grain. When the noon whistle blew, the harvesters dropped their tools and gathered beneath a solitary cottonwood, grateful for the thin strip of shade. A corporal from the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps handed out lunch. The familiar brown cartons of a K-ration. Each box, roughly the size of a soldier's mess kit, carried the surprising scent of abundance. Inside lay biscuits, a slab of sweet chocolate, packets of instant coffee and sugar, and the prize that never failed to start murmurs among the prisoners: a 4-pack of American cigarettes. Lucky Strikes, Camels, sometimes Chesterfields, each wrapped as neatly as a gift. The ration delivered about 2,830 calories a day, more than many German civilians were seeing in a week. Fritz Weber, the former carpenter from Camp Algona's Nativity Project, struck a match and drew on his first cigarette of the day. The smoke curled blue against the endless sky, and he thought of his mother in Essen, writing of black bread stretched with sawdust and of coal scrounged from the rubble. Around him, other prisoners savored their smokes with the quiet reverence of men who understood luxury by its absence. Carl Jensen, the Kansas farmer whose fields needed every hand he could get, leaned against the tree and poured coffee from a dented thermos. "Never thought I'd be feeding Germans to save the harvest," he said with a grin, offering the pot. Fritz accepted, careful with his English. "You share, even with enemies." Jensen shrugged. "It's a big country. Plenty to go around." The American system paid the government 45 cents an hour for each POW's labor. The men themselves earned 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, enough to buy more chocolate or a second pack of cigarettes if they wished. The economics puzzled Fritz. Back home, his nation rationed every crust, yet here the enemy paid its captives and sold them candy. As the prisoners finished their meal, the wind shifted and carried the low thunder of a passing freight train from miles away, a reminder of the great supply network that stitched the continent together. In that sound, Fritz heard the same unhurried confidence he had glimpsed in the Iowa Library and in the faces of American guards, the strength of a people so secure in their own freedom that even their prisoners could taste it. He crushed the last ember under his boot and shouldered his scythe. Overhead, the wheat whispered in the breeze like surf, and the smoke of 100 cigarettes drifted skyward, a fleeting signal of a democracy's quiet power. Weeks later, in the briefing room of Fort Kearny's Special Projects Division, Private Herbert Diedler sat before a wall-sized chart that shimmered in the light of overhead lamps. Columns of black ink marched like battalions across white paper. Statistics culled from War Department releases and printed proudly in Der Ruf. He had read them before, but seeing the numbers stretched floor to ceiling carried the force of revelation. 96,270 aircraft built in 1944 alone. 2,710 Liberty ships launched since 1941. Some assembled in less than 5 days, the average down to 42. U.S. steel output, 89 million tons in a single year. Diedler's mind flashed to the letter from his sister describing her winter in Nuremberg, cooking turnip soup on a stove that had gone cold for lack of coal. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison explained the figures with the quiet pride of a man who believed that democracy's strength lay not only in ideals, but in welders' sparks and factory whistles. "This," he said, tapping the column of aircraft numbers, "is how a free people fights. No whip, no secret police, just workers who know what's at stake." Across the room, a handful of hardline Nazis scoffed. "Propaganda," one muttered. Diedler felt the old reflex to agree, yet he could not ignore the evidence. The unending freight trains he had seen in Alabama, the K-rations with their 4 packs of cigarettes, the casual confidence of the guards. He thought of the American farmer who had poured him coffee without hesitation. Could all of it be a lie? Davison continued, describing how some Liberty ships had slid into the water after only 4 days and 15 hours of construction, faster than the time the Kriegsmarine needed to refit a single U-boat. Diedler pictured the dry docks at Kiel where rusting hulls waited weeks for repairs while Allied bombers roared overhead. The room fell silent except for the low hum of the projector. In that hush, Diedler felt the last scaffolding of Nazi certainty begin to crumble. These were not just numbers. They were the outline of an industrial democracy that had already outbuilt, outplanned, and outlasted the Reich. He folded the issue of Der Ruf in his lap, its pages still warm from the press. Somewhere beyond the walls, a Liberty ship's whistle sounded from the Narragansett docks, a deep metallic note that seemed to carry across the Atlantic itself. It was the sound of a people who could produce in 5 days what his homeland could no longer dream of in a year. The desert night glowed with a cold brilliance as Jürgen Wattenberg and his companions pressed westward across the Salt River's barren bed. It was the early hours of the 24th of December, 1944, and the Arizona air cut like glass. Their boots sank into powdery sand where they had expected to launch their homemade rafts, the river nothing more than a ribbon of moonlit dust. They had tunneled 178 feet under the Papago Park POW camp fence, a feat of patience that would have impressed any U-boat engineer. Now they carried canvas and rope meant for a river voyage that no longer existed. The men trudged on in silence, the chill biting through their wool coats. Each mile revealed the limitations of their plan. Without the river's cover, they would need to cross miles of open desert. Wattenberg knew the Americans would be searching by dawn, yet the vastness of the Sonoran night gave him a strange sense of freedom. He thought of the Atlantic hunts, the crush of depth charges, and the claustrophobic U-boat compartments. This open sky was a different kind of peril. Behind them, Captain James Whitaker organized the response. Jeeps equipped with the new M38 field radios, prototype sets capable of clear transmission across the desert, fanned out from the camp. He issued orders with calm efficiency. No shots were fired, no dogs unleashed in fury. This was a manhunt conducted under the quiet authority of the Geneva Convention, which the U.S. Army observed with deliberate care. By mid-morning, a patrol intercepted the first fugitives near a dry arroyo. The men surrendered without resistance, surprised when the soldiers offered water and cigarettes before the long ride back. Wattenberg was among the last captured, halted by a jeep whose headlights blazed like sudden day. The American sergeant who stepped out simply said, "Morning, Captain," as if greeting a colleague. Back at Papago Park, the prisoners were fed and questioned without insult. There were no beatings, no punitive measures beyond extra roll calls. For Wattenberg, the realization came slowly. The Americans held immense power, machine guns in the towers, jeeps at their command, yet chose restraint. The true force of this enemy lay not in brutality, but in the confidence of a nation certain of its own strength. That evening, as the desert cooled again and the stars sharpened to diamond points, Wattenberg sat in his barracks and considered the irony. He had tunneled beneath barbed wire to find freedom, only to glimpse it in the discipline and quiet decency of those who had captured him. The sound of a distant jeep faded into the stillness, a gentle reminder that America's greatest weapon was not its arsenal, but its character. Spring 1945 brought a rolling sea of green across the American Midwest. Wheat fields swayed under the prairie wind like a living ocean, and among the stalks moved an unexpected army, thousands of German prisoners harvesting side by side with American farmers. At a farm near Topeka, Kansas, Fritz Weber bent to his work, the scythe's arc whispering through the grain. The PW stenciled on his back caught the morning sun, a badge that seemed less a brand of captivity than a ticket into a vast machine of plenty. Carl Jensen, owner of the farm, worked beside him. With so many young Americans overseas, the government paid farmers 45 cents per hour for each POW laborer. The prisoners themselves earned 80 cents a day in camp scrip, enough for chocolate, tobacco, or an extra coffee at the canteen. Weber marveled at the transaction. His enemy not only fed him but paid him, and the pay could buy luxuries that his own countrymen, still under Allied bombs, could scarcely imagine. The statistics were staggering. Despite millions of men in uniform, U.S. farm output had risen 32% since 1940, providing grain for both domestic needs and Allied armies abroad. Each day, trains carried millions of bushels east to the ports and west to the Pacific. The low thunder of freight wheels rolled across the plains like a heartbeat of the Republic. At noon, Jensen produced a tin pail of sandwiches and poured coffee from a battered thermos. The smell of roasted beans drifted above the wheat as the men ate in companionable silence. "Never thought I'd share my lunch with the enemy," Jensen said finally, offering the pot. Weber accepted with a nod, choosing his English carefully. In Germany, we would not so easy. He meant more than hospitality. The easy mixing of enemy prisoners and American civilians, the unguarded exchange of food and conversation, spoke of a confidence deeper than military strength. This was a society whose abundance made suspicion unnecessary, whose democracy gave it an inexhaustible energy. As the afternoon waned, the wheat glowed amber under the sinking sun. Weber wiped sweat from his brow and listened to the distant clatter of another freight train heading toward the coast. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Liberty ships, 2,710 of them built in just 4 years, waited to carry this harvest to soldiers across the world. The sound of wheels on steel was the sound of a free nation's inexhaustible reach. When darkness fell and the men returned to camp, Weber carried with him the taste of strong coffee and the memory of an enemy who treated him as a fellow worker. In that simple act, he sensed the quiet strength of American democracy, a power measured not just in steel and ships, but in the generosity of its people. A March gale lashed Narragansett Bay, rattling the corrugated walls of the press room at Fort Kearny. Inside, the smell of hot metal and damp paper mixed with the salt wind, and the rotary press thundered like distant artillery. Private Herbert Diedler stood near the loading dock, clutching the latest issue of Der Ruf. He had written a letter 2 weeks earlier, a sharp complaint that the newspaper was nothing but Allied propaganda. In the Reich, such insolence would have earned a knock at the door at midnight. Here his words appeared in bold type, unedited and unpunished. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, poet turned soldier, scanned the first run with quiet satisfaction. His Special Projects Division had been charged with something audacious, to prove to German prisoners that democracy needed no censors. Davison's team believed that if these men could witness true debate, they might return to a shattered Germany carrying the idea of freedom like a torch. The pressmen worked with the speed of seasoned craftsmen, feeding reams of newsprint that rattled across steel rollers. By April 1945, the print run had swollen to 30,000 copies a week, each one destined for one of the 140 main POW camps scattered across 46 states. Letters poured in by the thousands, praise and fury alike, until the editors' desks disappeared beneath drifts of envelopes. Hardline Nazis inside the camps tried to burn the papers, threatening any prisoner who dared read them. Yet the very attempt at suppression drew larger crowds to the bulletin boards. Diedler watched men who once shouted party slogans now argue calmly about parliamentary government, their voices low but their eyes alight with curiosity. He felt his own certainty crack like thin ice. Davison walked past him and offered a knowing nod. "Freedom," he said over the roar of the presses, "is letting people say we're wrong." The words struck Diedler harder than any Allied shell. He thought of his sister's letters from Nuremberg, describing nights of hunger and silence broken only by the whistle of bombers. Here, even a prisoner's dissent became part of the public record. Outside, the clang of shipyard hammers drifted across the bay where Liberty ships, 2,710 launched since 1941, some in under 5 days, slid into the Atlantic to feed armies across the world. America's industrial might roared in steel and steam, but its quietest weapon was this, a newspaper willing to print the criticism of its enemies. As the press slowed and the final sheets stacked warm and fragrant, Diedler folded the issue beneath his arm. The metallic rhythm faded to a heartbeat's echo, and he knew that when he returned to Germany, he would carry more than memories of captivity. He would carry proof that a society secure in its own strength could afford to let even its prisoners speak freely. Across the United States in the spring of 1945, welders' torches flared like blue comets as Liberty ships slid from their ways on both coasts. Sparks fell in golden showers, bright enough to outshine the stars over Portland, Baltimore, and Mobile. Captain James Whitaker, recently transferred east, stood on a pier at Mobile Bay and felt the vibration of a ship's launch reverberate through the soles of his boots. The numbers alone seemed impossible. American yards had launched 2,710 Liberty ships in just 4 years. Some assembled in 4 days and 15 hours, the average down to 42. Aircraft plants had produced 96,270 planes in 1944 alone, more than the Luftwaffe fielded in its entire existence. U.S. steel output had reached 89 million tons that same year. Every statistic dwarfed the Reich's capabilities, and every figure whispered the same truth. A free people, given purpose, could outbuild any tyranny. Whitaker remembered the freight yards of Alabama where German prisoners had stared wide-eyed at endless boxcars of food and fuel. He thought of Fritz Weber savoring a cigarette in the Kansas wheat fields, of Diedler's letter printed unaltered in Der Ruf. All these small moments pointed to a larger revelation. America's strength was not only in machines, but in the confidence of a democracy that trusted its citizens and even its enemies with abundance. Along the waterfront, the air smelled of hot steel and salt spray. A freshly painted hull, gray and immense, eased down the greased ways with a low, rising moan. Tugs waited to guide her toward the open Gulf, where she would join convoys carrying grain, tanks, and fuel to 2 oceans of war. Each launch was both spectacle and routine. A single day's output in these yards sometimes surpassed what German shipyards managed in a month. Above the noise of whistles and cheering workers, Whitaker heard the deeper resonance of victory, the marriage of freedom and industry. These men and women were not driven by fear of the Gestapo, but by a conviction that their labor mattered. They were citizens turned soldiers of production, and their factories had become the decisive battlefield. As twilight settled and the torches flickered like fireflies along the pier, Whitaker realized that America had already won long before the guns fell silent. The avalanche of production, ships, planes, steel, and grain, was more than a feat of engineering. It was the visible proof that democracy, when fully armed with its own energy, could overwhelm any empire built on terror. Summer 1946 brought a humid dawn to New York Harbor, the skyline still wearing a faint wartime haze. German prisoners of war filed up the gangways of Liberty and Victory ships, their boots clanging on steel decks that had once carried weapons across the Atlantic. Among them walked Jürgen Wattenberg, the U-boat captain whose escape across the Arizona desert had ended not in gunfire but in a coffee cup offered by his captors. He paused at the rail as the harbor stirred awake. Tug whistles, the smell of salt and diesel, gulls wheeling over the gray water. The war was long over. Of the roughly 371,000 German POWs held across the United States, most were being repatriated now. All would be gone by 1947. For many, the journey home felt more like a graduation than a release. They carried pay chits earned at 45 cents an hour for farm work and canteen script spent on chocolate and Lucky Strikes. Letters from America, some from farmers, some from librarians, were tucked into their kits. Wattenberg held a small packet of photographs given by Captain James Whitaker, the dry salt riverbed where the escape had failed, and a candid snapshot of the 2 men shaking hands at Papago Park's gate. Nearby, Fritz Weber leaned against the rail beside Anna Mae Kruger, who had traveled from Algona to see the men off. The wooden figures of the nativity he helped carve still stood each Christmas on the Iowa fairgrounds, a silent testament to the winter when enemies became artisans. Anna Mae pressed a slim volume of Goethe into his hand. "So, you'll remember," she said, eyes bright against the morning glare. The prisoners traded quiet farewells with American guards who had become, improbably, friends. Some shook hands. Others exchanged addresses, promising to write from a Germany still scarred by bomb craters and ration cards. Herbert Diedler carried folded copies of Der Ruf, its pages yellowed but unbowed, proof that a free press could flourish even behind barbed wire. As the tugs nudged the ship into the channel, Manhattan receded into mist. Wattenberg studied the skyline, the jagged towers catching the first sunlight like the masts of an iron fleet. He thought of the jeeps with their M38 field radios, the Liberty ships built in less than 5 days, the endless trains of grain and steel. These were more than feats of industry. They were the architecture of a freedom that had defeated the Reich without mimicking its cruelty. A bell clanged and the ship's whistle bellowed, deep and resonant. The sound rolled across the harbor like a benediction. The prisoners leaned toward the open sea, carrying with them an invisible cargo, the memory of a nation whose greatest weapon had been the very freedom it defended. In the winter of 1947, Germany lay in ruins, cities pocked with craters, families huddled in unheated flats, the air thick with the smell of wet brick and coal dust. Yet across this scarred landscape returned men told a different story, of America, where even captives tasted liberty. Around kitchen tables in Bremen and Nuremberg, former prisoners like Herbert Diedler unfolded yellowed copies of Der Ruf and described the day their criticisms had been printed without fear. Mothers and fathers listened as sons spoke of K-rations that came with chocolate and a 4-pack of cigarettes, while children at home had scavenged for potato peelings. Fritz Weber recounted the Iowa winter when townspeople trusted enemy soldiers with saws and chisels to carve a nativity. That same December, American welders had launched Liberty ships in 4 days and 15 hours, a speed that still sounded like fantasy. Wattenberg told of his escape across the Salt River's dry bed and of the jeep patrol that captured him with courtesy instead of violence. These were not anecdotes of defeat. They were lessons in a kind of strength Germany had never known, strength born of democratic confidence. The statistics, once dismissed as propaganda, now stood as irrefutable fact. 96,270 aircraft built in 1944, nearly 300,000 by war's end, 2,710 Liberty ships sliding into the seas from 18 shipyards, U.S. steel output of 89 million tons in a single year. Allied air forces had lost roughly 40,000 aircraft over Europe, yet American production replaced losses faster than the Reich could destroy them. Such numbers were more than arithmetic. They revealed a truth that startled even those who had fought against it. A free society, uncoerced, could outbuild and outfight a dictatorship sustained by fear. American veterans, too, paid their price. 405,399 dead, thousands more wounded, proof that this abundance of steel was matched by human sacrifice. Their courage gave weight to the generosity that prisoners had witnessed, the quiet coffee shared in a Kansas field, the unguarded library books in Algona, the patient editorial hand at Fort Kearny. Years later, historians would note how these former prisoners became unwitting ambassadors for democracy. Their stories helped prepare West Germany for the parliamentary republic it would soon become, a bulwark against the totalitarianism they had once served. One evening in Bremen, as dusk settled over streets still scarred by war, Wattenberg looked toward the harbor and heard the distant whistle of a merchant ship. It sounded uncannily like the deep call of the Liberty ships that had once carried him back across the Atlantic. He closed his eyes and listened. The note seemed less a reminder of defeat than of an idea victorious, that freedom, armed with abundance and tempered by restraint, could conquer not only armies but hearts.